Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bevere, your host. I am a pastor, retired, professor, Bible moth, a theologian in exile, as well as a foreigner and stranger in exile in a strange land. And I am a peddler of hope. I'm also the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a completely fabricated institution of higher learning. But where all seekers are invited to ponder profound things. And I'm very pleased to have a distinguished member of our faculty here at FSUU, Michael Cruz, who is the Chair of Economics and Public Theology, the Grand Poobah Chair
Grand
of
Poobah Chair.
Economics and Public Theology. I need to get the title right there. So anyway, he is joining us. And Michael, you're doing pretty good, I think, but your Chiefs didn't quite take it all the way, did they?
That was pretty ugly.
Yeah.
That was about as ugly a game as I've seen. That was hard to watch.
Yeah, it wasn't a contest.
No,
The Chiefs kind of looked like they had been up partying too late the night before.
boy, it did.
Uh,
I think one of the big issues was still their offensive line. I
yeah,
think maybe in the games leading up to the Super Bowl, the offensive line uh, performed better than they are capable of usually performing, and I think they fell back to their median during the Super Bowl. So
yeah.
yeah, it was pretty sad.
It was sad, but the Eagles played solid football.
They were great. They
Yeah,
played a really
they
good game.
did. It
It was
was
fun to watch.
it was
Yeah.
a command performance. So
I say it was fun to watch. It was fun to watch their excellence. They did. The game wasn't so much fun.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's you scowl and say, "Boy, that was a good play."
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So it's pretty much the whole game.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we got March Madness coming up shortly, and it's one part of the basketball season I really enjoy. I'm not a big basketball watcher like my
Yep.
wife, but I love to watch March Madness, and I
Yeah.
just always find it to be interesting. And we've got about a month till opening day.
I know. And opening day is my birthday this year.
Is
We're
it
going to
really?
the game on opening day,
Well,
sitting up in the nosebleeds. But
maybe
we'll,
the Royals will give you a present
yeah,
in the
that's
first.
right.
Yeah.
Well, of course,
No,
they're
go
playing
ahead.
the Guardians, on opening day. So
Oh, are they playing the Guardians? Well, then
yeah.
I hope I know.
You
I
hope I have a horrible
no,
opening day.
no. I hope that doesn't happen. Okay. Maybe after you lose, though, you and your wife can go out and get some barbecue. So
There
that'll
we go. That'll work. Right.
yeah. So anyway, and I do want to say, by the way, since baseball is my favorite sport, I do want to say to President Musk and Agent Krasnov, keep your grubby paws off our game. It
Absolutely.
is America's game, and you guys are corrupting everything you touch, so stop.
Give us something to have enjoyment with. Yes, you're right.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Well, on that note, let's get into our subject.
Yes.
And the
Okay.
question today is, will Donald Trump fail?
Uh-huh.
We're going to riff off of a YouTube video that you sent to me. It's about 10 minutes. It's a really good video. We're going to put the link in the description. So, folks, we encourage you to watch it. If you want, you can pause us now and go watch the video and then come back or watch it later. It's up to you, but we want to provide that for you. Um, and this person gives 5 reasons that Donald Trump will fail. Now,
Right.
I want to say at the beginning of this conversation, we are not minimizing the fact that Donald Trump has caused a lot of pain so far, and he will continue to do so.
Much more.
And real people are being hurt, and it's very serious. So we're not minimizing this. But what we're having the conversation about is, will ultimately Donald Trump and his minions, will they end up failing and not getting everything that they hope for, and not um, Michael, I want to say at the beginning, I think our democracy is pretty resilient.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about that, but
Right.
yes, I don't think. I mean, I understand the concern that people have, how easy it is to dismantle a free society, but
Right.
I think we Americans have had too much practice at democracy.
Yeah, we can talk about that some either maybe at the end or I mean about why we think that is. But
Yeah,
yeah,
so let's do that. So let's do that.
yeah.
So let's get into the five reasons. So
Well,
the first, go
well,
ahead.
so I just wanted to point out that the gentleman who made the video, his name is Brendan Miller.
Thank you.
He was a former television producer and a filmmaker.
Yeah.
He worked did a lot of work for the BBC. He's also done some things for the New York Times, and in most recent years, he's gone to work trying to create short film explainers about things.
Yeah.
And this struck me. I don't know. This is the first contact I've had with his work in terms of any detail. I was just struck by it from things I have gleaned from other sources. I thought he did a good job of explaining some of the things that I've heard elsewhere. And so it's a good summary of some things.
Yeah, and he's got a Substack. We're going to put all those links in the description for people.
Right.
He is certainly informed and intelligent, and he sounds intelligent because he has a British accent, so that automatically makes him sound smart. But it is really worth the time. And speaking of Substack, just so you know, folks, uh, please, if you're watching on YouTube, like us. And you can subscribe for free if you want. And then also, if you're listening via podcast, make sure you like us, and that helps, and we appreciate that. And by the way, to let you know that there's a new Substack that I started called the Kakistocracy
Right.
Report. What's that?
I say exactly. I love it.
Yeah, the Kakistocracy is a government run by the worst, most corrupt people. So, in case you're wondering who am I referring to, and it's a new Substack. It's taken off. We got great contributors. I got Michael. I can't believe the people I've reached
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
who are more than willing to contribute, and just
Yeah.
stuff. And it's free. It's always free.
Yeah.
So feel free to subscribe. And I will put all those links in. So anyway, okay, there's our shameless self-promotion for the day. All right.
Okay.
So the first argument that our friend makes that Donald Trump will fail is the first thing is everything changes in politics.
Right.
You want to comment on that?
Yeah, and he points back historically to going back over 40 or 50 years of election cycles and how things happen. Even talking about, for instance, in 1964, Johnson won in a landslide election and then backed out of running for the presidency for that second term in 68. Nixon won in a huge landslide in 1972 and resigned from office 2.5 years later. You have Carter, who could not, things turned on him after he had taken over from Ford of those Nixon years. He won wasn't a landslide, but it was a popular vote. Well, he was out 4 years later. Bush Sr. had similar problems. And you come into more recent years, you had President Trump, things turned on him in 4 years. And then you had Joe Biden, things turned on him in 4 years. Yeah. So it's, and I think part of the thing that he's emphasizing is that when they first step into power, there automatically seems to be a dynamic that goes into play, something he calls the thermostatic politics, which is just the idea that when things tend to push one direction, the tendency is for them to reduce back to the mean because they're pulled from the other direction. He shows again about, when Barack Obama becomes president, you see the country becoming steadily more conservative during his administration. And then Trump becomes president and it becomes more liberal. And then Biden becomes president, it becomes more conservative. So there's this tendency to sort of pull away from whoever has power, a reaction against the incumbency. So power always becomes contested, was his point. He says, even dictators who don't have to worry about elections lose power. So I think the main point I took was don't perceive what is happening now and just project that unabated going out to the future.
Yeah.
That's
right. That's right. So to be honest, we like to focus in politics, I think, on the extremes, right? The edges on both sides, because I guess that's interesting.
Right.
But the reality is that a fair chunk of the electorate is not partisan and they're not ideological.
Right.
They may have their preferences. They may lean one way or another, but you can lose them.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say too that I think one of the key points he makes too, which is probably one of the things he was trying to emphasize, he says this thermostatic principle, he says, is particularly true when the president promises more than they can deliver.
Yeah.
Now, of course, that didn't happen in this election at all.
Right.
But
Right.
and all presidents, they blow some smoke up the bloomers every now
Yeah.
and then, with some stuff. But we are seeing something in this last election where he promised everything and anything, and stuff that is you can't accomplish both things at the same time.
Right.
So there are going to be people that will.
Well, and he
pass.
said during the debate with Kamala Harris that he would solve the Ukraine war even before he was president.
Right. He
Right.
bring down food prices on day one.
Day one. So he does make these incredibly yeah. The only thing about that, Michael, I think about sometimes is I think that there are people who voted for him who knew all of that, who knew
Right.
but they voted for him anyway.
Right. Right.
But at the same time, there are people who actually, you and I have had this conversation. The average American, and I'm not trying to say people are stupid, but the average
Right.
American doesn't understand the economy,
Right.
how it works. I mean, I'm no expert in the economy. I'm going to
Yeah.
put myself in that group. But there is this popular idea out there that somehow the president has this magic button in the Oval Office,
Right.
and the only person who knows that says economy on it. And the only person who knows how to push it and make things better is the president from their party or the president they voted for. And so
Right.
it's just goofy, but it's always been that way. I mean, if you go back to the mid 19th century, you had, presidents being ousted because economic downturn, which wasn't their fault.
Exactly.
Andrew
Right.
Jackson goes out, a very popular president, but his destruction of the National Bank and other things
Right.
took effect when it was the bad thing, took effect with Martin Van Buren, and he
Yeah.
left and he had nothing to do with it, right? It was what Jackson did. So the point
Right.
simply is that there is this general ignorance about the complexity of the economy, and for better or for worse, the president gets blamed for it or gets praised for it one way
Right.
or another.
Right. And I've said this before, and I still hold to this, that I think a big piece of this last election was that this whole thing was an extension of the COVID pandemic that hit, the aftermath of that. And I think you look at a lot of the voters, particularly that typically you would think would have swung towards Harris, swung towards Trump this last time. They were not well informed voters who knew much about either candidate, but their general sense was a general sense of unease and frustration over what had come out of COVID, and specifically with things like prices, inflation, and the economy. And they, I think, thoroughly inaccurately, but their perception was Trump was this great businessman with this acumen who was going to help fix the economy and make things better. And that's what he promised.
Yeah.
And that's the reason a whole bunch of these less informed voters voted for him. And what are they seeing? And I think that's
sometimes you almost hate to just even go into the details because people aren't paying attention, right? I mean,
right.
When all these stimulus checks were being offered during COVID, everybody was saying it's going to lead to inflation, right?
Yeah, right.
Other things, that's not the only thing, but
right.
But in other words, inflation was inevitable, but it needed to be done.
Right.
Right. And
right.
And by the time Biden election comes, a lot of people forget that or don't even think about that. And
right. Exactly. So
I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So all right. Argument number 2: you break it, you own it.
Yeah.
And I keep forgetting his name. Our friend who made the video.
Brandon Miller.
Brandon Miller. Let's go, Brandon.
There you go.
Brandon Miller says that that we're now in a situation where Trump just can't blame anybody for things when they don't work. That he now owns it. And by the way, the Republicans own it because the Republicans, although the majorities are very slim, they basically own Congress. And so certainly Trump will, because he does this, everything is somebody else's fault. And he's already blaming Biden for things that, of course, he's been president. But the point simply is that there is a large part of the electorate that doesn't buy that, and that he now has the keys.
Right.
And so if we end up with prices going up because of these tariffs, which I think is probably going to happen,
Hmm.
If we, given the way he is treating, frankly, our allies and what he is doing, I think there's a lot of Americans who don't like what he's doing to Ukraine.
Right.
That the reality is that at some point it's his.
Right.
And other than his absolute diehard supporters, he will be held responsible for things when they go south.
Right. Yeah. And you add to that things like they are. Yesterday they had this vote about their blueprint for their budget. The House did pass by one vote. Now, my understanding from what I've been reading is that this is just a blueprint that says we want to do this much spending, and so what you got to do now is go back to your committees and find all that money. And so there was no commitment to cut anything, but there's only one way you get to that type of cut that they're talking about, and that's you're going to cut hundreds of billions of dollars out of Medicare. That's the way you get there. And so when that comes through, you look all across rural America, and rural America is disproportionately more dependent on that Medicare coverage for the health of many of their citizens. And in fact, we've been seeing hospitals and medical care facilities drying up all across rural America, and the ones that are remaining, many of them are surviving because they're on Medicare payments. And you take that away, and you're going to have swaths of some of these rural areas, particularly in red states, where there just isn't going to be any medical coverage,
Yeah.
and people aren't going to have medical insurance. And
Yeah.
so that's just another layer to the whole economic thing that's going to develop. Now, I don't know that they're going to get Medicare cut soon, but we'll see.
Yeah. Now, you know what interests me, Michael?
Medicaid.
I've thought about that with Medicaid.
Yeah.
Republicans in Congress know this. They know what you just said.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like, what's their end game here?
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out what their end game is. Are they trying to demonstrate that they're being loyal to Trump
Yeah.
and therefore, but knowing that they're not going to get what they want to get, or get maybe some of it, but certainly not a lot of it?
Right.
What is the end game here? Because yes, if they were to get everything that they say they want, it would be a disaster for their constituents.
I know. And I reflect on that too, and I'm not sure I understand exactly how they think this is going to come out, except for the fact that they may think that Trump is going to be able to so dominate and swamp the system that even if their voters become unhappy with them, that as long as they're aligned with Trump, they can survive.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that that's what they're thinking, but I could see that kind of reasoning.
It's just there's just so much insanity in it. It's just
Yeah, right.
yeah. But you know, so anyway, so he does own it and they will own it.
Right.
And Brandon talks about the fact that even dictators who don't depend on voters nevertheless end up usually having to leave power. And of course, Assad in Syria is one of the most recent examples. The other thing that he talks about, nope, that's the next one, overreach.
Okay. I was gonna say Bolus, how you say it, Bolsonaro or whatever his name
Bolsonaro.
is. Was another one, kind of came in with this whole dictatorial approach to things, and he was out 4 years later.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that, and he also mentioned too, which I've been hearing several analysts talk about, that right. It used to be that you wanted to be the incumbent because incumbents tended to get reelected with great regularity. Now everything is anti-incumbent across the whole world when it comes to political leaders. So being an incumbent is not a good position to be in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So all of this becomes over time becomes bad news.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, much damage is being done. But I always just want to say to people who think democracy in America is over, don't throw it out the window yet. Because
not yet, not anywhere near yet. Yeah.
And we'll talk more about that at the end. But
right.
Yeah. So, okay. So the third one, and I want to talk about this one. This one really resonates with me, is overreach.
Okay. Yeah.
Overreach.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've said over the years is that both parties somehow get this goofy idea that because in this election, pick the year,
right?
This election, the electorate chose their party, that somehow that gives them a mandate to do whatever they want.
Right. Yeah.
And they discover 2 years later, no.
Yeah.
That's not what you've been given. And so it is inevitable that they always overreach. They
Right.
always think that somehow everybody is approving of everything they want to do, and they discover otherwise. And so, people say, well, somebody wins by a landslide, a president, and 2 years later, the president loses control of Congress.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just like
Regularly.
at some point, does a president come into office and saying, "Hey, look, folks, let's understand, right? They gave us the keys to the car, but they're not interested in us driving it in a ditch."
Right.
I mean, it's just amazing to me.
How
And of
can we
course,
make this thing work for everybody?
yeah, and
Opposition party, how can I incorporate what it is that you want to get done into what we're trying to do here? And how can we be a strong force going? Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just amazing. And
Yeah.
and Trump won by what, 1.2% or something like that.
Yeah.
And of course, he's talking about mandates, but then Trump lies with everything and
Yeah.
exaggerates.
Right.
So that's not a
Yeah.
surprise. There's no mandate here.
No, there isn't.
You're in charge of Congress narrowly,
Right.
and I think one of the most narrow margins in a long, long time. Anyway,
Right. Right.
and your president was among registered voters. He won 31% of the vote, and
Right.
so you don't
He,
have overreach.
he didn't win 50% of the people who did vote.
Yeah.
Like
So yeah, exactly right.
49.7% or something. I don't know what it was, but he didn't even win 50% of that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So the overreach, and of course, we're already seeing what he's doing with Musk. And
Yeah.
Musk, of course, has become really unpopular.
Really toxic.
You might argue that he's even more unpopular than Trump at the moment,
Yeah. Right.
because of what he is doing and the stories that are starting to come out of the human cost
Right.
of what Musk is doing, and that it's very clear to those of us who are rational is that he's not saving money. He's not looking to save money. That's not the way you do things. So, I mean, so this is probably, Michael, I would say in our lifetime of watching governments and presidents, this is probably the biggest example of overreach
Oh, absolutely.
we have
Yeah.
seen. It's
Yeah.
huge.
By huge margin. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. I think that's totally right. I was trying looking down here and see if I mean, one of the things that he mentions was this idea he was saved by God to make America great again, because of the surviving his assassination attempt. But he talked about the January 6th pardons is extremely unpopular. Over 80% of people, disagree with that. The tariffs, the freeze on the loans, Elon Musk. You talk about threats to Medicaid. You talk about other government services that are just being cut randomly without much analysis, and all of that is overreach.
Yeah.
And eventually people get tired of that.
Yeah.
And particularly once they begin to feel the consequences of it. So.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing is mentioned about being saved by God. I mean, the reality is, except for the small minority of what I'm going to call religious fundamentalist extremists who actually think that way.
Right.
Most Americans who are religious, from very religious to nominally religious, are very uncomfortable with that kind of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They're not comfortable
Yeah.
with believing that their president or whomever has been called by God to do a job, that we have,
Right.
that there is this visceral kind of feeling that is a license for abuse, because if God has called me, chosen me, then I get to do what I want, the divine right of kings, so to speak.
Right.
So the reality is, except for those few vocal MAGA people, the vast majority of religious people aren't. That kind of language doesn't do much for them. It just doesn't.
It almost feels kind of sacrilegious. I mean,
yeah, it feels like sacrilege. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and also it's again with Americans, it's like, okay, if you're called by God, show me what you do. Let me see let me see how you're fulfilling your calling.
Right. Let's see the fruits of the Spirit here.
Let's see the fruit. So this is clearly overreach.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who are going to, at some point, if not already, rebelling against that.
Right.
So, and they do talk, Brandon talks about that Trump even knows that there's sometimes too much extremism with the way he backed off the abortion issue.
Right.
Knowing that could be a loser because of these draconian anti-abortion laws that have caused the deaths of approximately 12 women around the country since
Right.
Dobbs' decision, who were
Right.
not able to get care for their pregnancy that had gone south.
Right.
Um,
Well, and also talk about backing away from things. This, you talk about flip-flopping on stuff that could, I think, end up biting you in the end. All during the campaign, he kept distancing himself from Project 2025, that he didn't know about any of this stuff. That was not part of his campaign. And then the moment he gets elected, he starts trying to implement it all and puts the guy who wrote the plan as a part of his Office of Management and Budget Director. Um, so you had this denial that this is what he was about, kept saying all during the campaign, and now that he's president, he's doing it. And I think that's not going to get a lot of people. That's getting a little too wonky.
Yeah.
I think for people that are more just drive-by political observers, but I do think that could have some impact as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I do think, again, except for the handful of diehard supporters, that it's bald-faced lying. I don't know anything about this, but by the way, I'm going to pick all these people who
Right.
wrote the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's the third argument. So the fourth argument is really, I mean, out of all the arguments, and I liked all the arguments he made, this one really rings true to me. Succession failure.
Yes. Right.
What's succession failure?
Well, I mean, talking about first of all, he's old. He's what, going on 79 years old, whatever it is. And he's term limited. So he'll only have 4 years. And I know that there's all these talks about, he's going to somehow try to get a third term. I think that is exceedingly remote. He's basically going to have to become a super powerful dictator over the next 4 years before he could ever make that happen. It required a constitutional amendment to change it. And there's no way to get there with a constitutional amendment. So I think he would be out. So then, but if you're going to go this direction with his ideology and his plan, somebody's got to pick up after him. Somebody's got to follow with this. And he talks about this idea of a purity spiral. I don't know if that was one of the things that I was struck with, is that so then you start having people who compete to out Trump, but they don't have the charisma that Trump has to do that, to carry that. And he talks about a lot of these people that will be following afterwards. If they're going to win, the only way that they're going to win is that they will have to move back more towards the center. Will have to become more of a center-right candidate in order to get the votes, because they don't have Trump's unusual charisma and unusual backing. And I don't know if I'm walking over what you were drawing, but here was one of the key things that was the key nuts in all of this. That, and maybe we can talk more about this at the end. He talks about that holding power requires two things: coercive force as well as legitimacy. That you have to have those two things. And he has the coercive force. He's in control of the government. He's got Congress. He's got the Supreme Court leaning his direction on most things. So the rest of the courts, I mean, I think there's a lot of work can be done, but we're going to have problems with the Supreme Court with some things. I'm confident of it. So he has those in his power. But the idea is, even Putin knows this, is that he has to maintain at least a sham appearance of having legitimacy. Why do they have elections? They're sham elections, but he still has to keep this, this sense of legitimacy. And when you start to lose legitimacy, people are no longer cowered by the coercive power, and then you begin to lose control of the system, and down it goes. And so I think that I think his ability, he's going to have problems, and that he's not going to be able to maintain his own legitimacy, and anybody picking up behind him isn't going to have that either. I think that's the challenge. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think that's interesting. When I was listening to this, of course, I was thinking of Ron DeSantis. If you remember, he was the fair-haired successor for Donald Trump. Everybody, he's a popular governor in Florida, so everybody was like, "This is the guy." And then he tanks because he just doesn't have Donald Trump's charisma. I struggle to understand that, but he's got, but you can't deny it because
it's there,
because it's there. And but Ron DeSantis just doesn't have it,
right?
And he found ways to reinforce that he doesn't have it,
right?
So, So, so he didn't do it. So the question and by the way, JD Vance doesn't have it.
No, he doesn't have it either. No.
And so who's going to be the person who's going to step in to do that?
Right.
And it's going to be tough to do that. By the way, one thought on this. I was watching a TED Talk last night, and I'm going to put the link in the description because it's really
Yeah.
good. This is from a guy who has studied leadership for I don't know how long. Like that's his thing. He
Right.
studies leadership, and it's about 18 minutes. It's a
Okay.
video in which he explains why so often we choose the wrong leader.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
And part of it is this that so he gives examples of people that we have upheld for their leadership and their courage and everything. And
Right.
he says, when you drill down, he says, actually, they're a disaster.
Yeah.
He says,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he says, the people who are the true leaders don't get the press because true leadership, more often than not, is boring.
Yes.
And
Right.
and so what do we do is we go after, the excitement. And he says, if you want to, if and he uses the two leaders he uses is the pole explorers, Ernest Shackleton, and I can't think of his first name. Last name is Adamson.
Right. Yeah.
And Adamson was this great explorer, and I mean, when you read what he did and how he did it, it's amazing, but it's boring. It doesn't
Right.
make for an interesting story. But Shackleton, who wrecks boats and ice and
Right. Yeah.
doesn't plan well for the trip, and it creates a lot of drama. So we read all of this, but people survive, and we say, "Oh, what a wonderful leader." Well, if you really knew, if you wanted to go with one of these two guys to the South Pole, and you knew what was involved, you wouldn't go with Shackleton, right? That's
There
the
you go.
argument he makes.
Yeah.
So this fix, it seems to me, is in here is that you've got a lot of people. I mean, Trump is. I'm trying to think of a president in our lifetime, and I don't think there has been, who is more of a myth
Yes.
than
Yes.
anyone, right?
Yeah.
He's
Right.
more of a myth. I
Yeah.
mean, and just look at all the portrayals of him with machine guns and ripped like he's a weightlifter, and of course
Yeah.
he's nothing like that.
Right.
And yet, by the way, just to make a connection to authoritarians, Hitler was portrayed in this way.
Yeah.
Hitler was often drawn in ways that made him look tough and
Right.
he's just a little guy, and he's not
Yeah.
even an Aryan, right?
Yeah.
He
Right.
doesn't
Yeah.
fit the description, but he was mythologized.
Right.
And Trump, he is, of all president, there's always a mythology that surrounds everybody, and I get that.
Right.
But this is just incredible, the myths that have been made out of this guy.
Well, and that is what he is. He's got all these problems and weaknesses, but that's what his strength is being able to tap into the zeitgeist, to tell a story, to
Yeah.
present an appearance, a performance.
Yeah.
That's what he does. Everything is performance.
Yeah.
And you're talking about also, why do we select bad leaders? And I've also remember, I don't know if it's a TED Talk or article I was reading sometime back, but the idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect, the idea that when we learn a little bit about something, we become very confident that we know what the answers are. People who actually know topics, who are very well informed, always tend to be a little more cautious about how they frame things, not stating things absolute. That there's this, but there's these contingencies. So they will tend to be a little more circumspect about how they talk about things and present things. But people equate bluster and confidence with leadership,
Yeah.
and knowledge, and that's what Trump excels at is bluster, and exuding all this confidence about things he knows nothing about.
Yeah,
And
and that was one of the points of the YouTube video too.
okay, yeah. So that
Confidence and bluster. I alone can fix it,
yes,
right?
right, yeah,
Yeah. So, and again, that will wear thin, and his successors, whoever is a successor, not going to be able to match that. Well, that's
right.
actually good news, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, exactly. Well, and he has just dominated the whole Republican universe for the past 10 years now. And we're going to be pushing on, how many years will it have been? 15 to 28, so we're talking 13, 14 years by the time this is all done. Um, you have all these people that have been waiting in the wings to try to emerge
Yeah.
from his shadow, and they're all going to be at each other as well too. There
Yeah.
isn't just going to be one successor. That's my thinking.
You
Yeah.
know what I really hope happens, Michael, and I think, I mean, I know on what I'm about to say, the first point you agree with me because we've
Yeah.
talked about it,
Right.
is that any society requires a vital liberalism and a vital conservatism, right?
Right.
Being liberal and conservative, and I don't mean left and right, those are different things.
Right.
Liberal and conservative is endemic to any society or movement. And
Right.
society functions best when you have a healthy and vital conservatism and liberalism. We do
Right.
not have a healthy, vital conservatism at the moment because of Donald Trump.
No.
So, what I really hope, this is my hope, is that after
Yeah.
the days of Trump are over, that the Republicans find themselves a minority party for a while. I mean, a real
Right.
minority party.
Right.
They have to be in the wilderness in order
Right.
to get their bearings again, right? If
Right.
they're ever
Yeah.
going to emerge as a vital conservatism,
Right.
as we've seen in the past, right? I mean,
Right.
it's been there. Uh,
Right.
you and I have voted for conservatives,
Yes.
so we
Yeah.
know that it exists. Uh,
Right.
they have to be in the wilderness for a while. They've got to do some soul searching, and so I
Right.
just kind of hope. I kind of hope for a while we throw them out and let them regroup, and hopefully they come back more moral and more sane.
Right. Yeah. That basically sums up kind of where my hopes are that's where we'll end up. But we will see. Yeah.
We'll see. We'll find out.
Yeah.
Okay, we got the last one, number
Yeah.
5. His ideas won't work, Michael. His ideas will just not work.
Right.
So what ideas of his won't work?
Well, I mean, some of the things, the one that just most obvious to me of all of them, is this whole thing about tariffs. It's just because one that I know about. I mean, his insistence that foreign countries are the ones who pay tariffs, and that's not going to cause any problem for American consumers, is just absurd. It's positively idiotic. The company that imports the product is the one who pays the tariff, and to make up for the price they had to pay for the tariff, they increase the price that goes to the consumer. It's that simple. I mean, it really is. Now, there are macroeconomic factors that on any particular product or any particular industry, some things may actually get cheaper, in the United States. But overall, when you're looking at the overall market basket of goods, things are going to get more expensive. There will be inflation, and so you have those kind of ideas that they're not based in reality, and so they're not. When you try to act as though they are reality, they don't work.
Yeah.
And he's got that across a range of different things.
So let me ask you a question on that, because one of the things I hear from people in response is, they want to give examples of times when tariffs have worked. And so what is the difference between general tariffs, which is what I think Trump wants to do,
Right.
and targeted tariffs? I mean, there is a case to
Sure.
be made for targeted tariffs, correct?
Yeah, I
What's
agree.
the difference?
I think the idea is usually you're doing well. Let's back up. So back in American history, we did have very high tariffs in the 1800s, and part of the problem is that we were an industrializing country, so we weren't industrialized yet, but we were on our way. We were trying to get there, and we've seen this happen with other countries in the 20th century who are industrializing. That you put tariffs to keep foreign manufacturers out for a time to give your local industries a chance to build up, to become strong so that they can compete. And then when those companies do become productive, they usually get to the point where their local country's market is not big enough to consume the goods that the companies are producing. So the companies need to be able to export. And so then that's what you tend to see, is that you tend to see tariffs coming down because they need to have free trade in order for their companies to be able to trade elsewhere. And I'm talking here about broad range of things. And so countries that are advanced, that have highly productive economies, generally speaking, low tariffs is what helps those countries go. Tariffs will hurt countries, uh, industrialized countries, highly productive countries, because they've got to have somewhere to produce. If you put everything in the United States, you tried to take all of our production and put it in the United States, um, a lot of these countries would not be able to compete because they produce far more than they could ever sell in the United States. Yeah. And so you end up collapsing that. Now, there are specific cases where tariffs can be useful. Sometimes you have a country like China, and I'm trying to remember a specific product, but let's just say cars. They make cars, and then the government subsidizes the manufacture of those cars. And their reason for doing it is because they want to export those cars to try to take the market share from other countries where they're making their own cars. Well, the car makers and the places where they're shipping those cars, they can't compete because they don't get the subsidies that the Chinese government's giving them. So maybe you then impose tariffs to make those cars that are coming in more expensive so that they're more competitive with your domestic automobiles. So you might target a particular industry like that. Most of our trade deals try to find mechanisms for managing it so that you don't get into that situation where those kind of things happen. Also, like with China, using them as an example again, if they start behaving in ways that say are threatening to Taiwan, then maybe you target one or two key industries that they're shipping to the United States where they've got a good, strong connection to the United States to make it more costly for them and get sort of using a stick to try to get them to be more to bend to you what your political interests are. And using that strategically can be one tool. By it alone, I don't think is effective. But along with a set of other tools, there are ways that you do that as well. And then a third thing, sometimes I think there are things where you could say, we need to not be dependent on another country for a handful of some key things that we produce so that in times of crisis or times of war, we aren't left without being able to produce that product. Yeah. And so sometimes you may have tariffs and things like that in order to protect a local industry. But the idea of having a tariff across all the products from a nation like Canada and Mexico, which make up more than half of our trade, is just crazy. I mean, that will definitely harm the economy.
Brings prices up, yeah. Brings prices up, and so it's just the way that it is. And so tell just a little bit, because Trump likes to use the example of William McKinley.
Yes.
And tariffs, and we were, because of that, we were so prosperous. That's not exactly the way it shook out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a period of history I haven't studied as much as some others, but the basic thing is that when McKinley, he was chair of the Ways and Means, I think it was, in the House in 1890, and he passed this tremendously big tariff bill across all these products. And again, that's where I would say a lot of these companies were nascent companies that were just becoming industrialized, and they were having to compete with foreign goods that were coming in. So they wanted to impose these tariffs on to protect local industry. And I can't remember the whole sequence of events now and how it played out. Grover Cleveland came into office, I think it was in 1892 for his second term, and then we had a depression, an economic depression that lasted about 3 years. It had more to deal with the gold and silver standards and some of the other issues that were going on. Tariffs was a piece of that, and he did try to reduce tariffs some. But then McKinley won the presidency in 96, and he reinstituted tariffs again, not maybe quite to the level of 1890, but he ratcheted them back up again. But already by the end of his first term, he was beginning to realize that these tariffs were beginning to hurt American industries because they needed to be able to export. And in 1901, when he was at the exposition in Buffalo, was the first time that he made this extensive speech talking about how he had converted to this idea that we needed to radically lower tariffs in order to compete in the world. And then it was the next day that he was shot at the exposition there. And so his policy Roosevelt didn't really pick up on that. So it was sometime later before we got to that point. but McKinley's uh, world, the structure of the economy of the United States at that time was thoroughly dissimilar to what we have today.
Yeah.
And they did use tariffs in order to fund the government. The government was far smaller portion of the economy. And this gets into one of the other things about tariffs. They're talking about introducing tariffs now because we're going to fund the government. We're going to get rid of income taxes and we're going to fund it through tariffs. That's what Trump says. At the same time, we're going to increase American manufacturing. Well, think about those two things together. If you're going to have our government income based on tariffs, that means you need to be importing a lot of stuff so that you can charge the tariffs to them to support our government. But you're going to increase American manufacturing, which means you're going to make more of the stuff in the United States, so you don't need to import the stuff,
Yeah.
which means you can't fund the government.
Yeah.
Again, it's two things that you can't accomplish both.
Yeah, it's like what do I say now? Make up off the top of my head so I can convince people or dupe people into supporting me. It's just so strange. I mean,
Right.
politicians, again, we all know they promise things they can't deliver, but boy,
Right.
the contradictions are so
Yes.
staggering. Wasn't a tariff also in place before the Depression, the Great Depression?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, it happened it was a response to the Depression that was developing. They were trying to protect American industries. And so the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was to try to protect American industries. And that just made things worse because then they couldn't export anything. It killed trade. So, and one of the impacts of tariffs is that part of what keeps prices down is by having a number of companies and competing against each other. And so they have to compete to keep the prices low. If you lock out a whole bunch of competitors and you have domestic industry, inevitably those local producers become lackadaisical. They don't compete as hard and they don't become as productive as they otherwise would have been had they had to compete against other companies. And so that there's an atrophy of the economy that begins to develop very quickly after you do that. So, yeah.
Good stuff. We need to end there, but I do want to have a little bit of a conversation. I mentioned it
Right.
because I said, and I think it's true, that I think people need to not panic and count democracy in America out.
Right.
Again, I want to reiterate that doesn't mean in the meantime there aren't going to be people who are really hurt by what Trump is doing and Musk, and they're already being hurt. I know some of them. By the way, let me real quick say about his ideas won't work. USA Aid. The one thing that does not understand that everybody who knows foreign policy understands is that you've got two kinds of power. You've got hard power, which is military, and you've got soft power, which is diplomacy.
Right.
USA Aid was started by John F. Kennedy.
Right.
To be able to go into places where there was great need, offer humanitarian need, because that's what we should do, because we're a wealthy country, but also freeze out the Soviets from getting their mitts into Kenya or Sudan or wherever it was. And so by doing what they've done with USA Aid is that it's really a rejection of soft power. So who's going to fill the void? The Russians, the Chinese. They're going to go in and they'll say, look, all right, so the Americans, to the Kenyans, the Americans won't feed you, and to the Cameroonians, they're not going to provide you with anti-malarial drugs and netting. I go to Cameroon and Zimbabwe. You can't find a bed that doesn't have a net over it. And why is it? Because, and I can tell you, these folks can't afford to buy a net.
Right.
I've seen them scramble looking for a piece of tape. Okay.
Right.
So we're rejecting that soft power, and who's gonna, and it's going to make us less influential.
Right.
It's going to put us, we will not be a major player on the world stage if this is allowed to continue.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it's just another way in which stuff doesn't work. So he says 5 reasons Trump will fail is the name of his video. And so all these 5 things that we've looked at, I subscribe to all of them in varying degrees, to varying degrees of intensity, but I think he's right on all 5.
Yeah.
And like you said, democracy, I think, will eventually prevail. I think the sobering part for me is is that I think this is going to get much worse before it gets better than I had hoped, and possibly much more worse, much worser than I had been thinking. Some of the things that I look at, for instance, are there's this guy who's the Office of the Special Counsel that was fired by Trump. He's one of these people who's appointed to a position for like 5 years. I think he gives his position is to give counsel and advice to the various agencies and their employees about law. Well, so he was in this position. Trump decided to get rid of him and put somebody else in. That Office of Special Counsel person is appealing that to the courts, and it's on its way to the courts. It's already Trump tried to appeal it up to the Supreme Court, which has put a brief abeyance on it while it processes through a court below it before they get there. But there's this thing on the Supreme Court among some of the members of the Supreme Court called the unitary power of the president, which is the idea that the president is the executive. So the president should have all authority over everything that happens under the executive branch. Now, as I've read on this, there is sort of a soft version on this, and there's a hard version of it, and there could be various permutations of it. But here's the thing. It looks like at least three of the justices, certainly Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, they want to say that these positions and these entities that have been created where they have these people where they're appointed to 5 years and they can only be fired for cause and so on. President can put in whoever he wants, whenever he wants, and they're supposed to do what he says. And so they're ready to rule that this particular guy's argument is unconstitutional. And it sounds like from the authorities I'm reading, Kavanaugh is almost certainly in that position as well. The other three, I think, have made very clear. And so that's 4 votes. And now you're down to what happens with Roberts and Coney Barrett.
Right.
And either one of those goes in that direction, which is possible, but not quite as certain as those 4 are. That means that all of these positions where Congress tried to create them to get them to span over administration so they'd be less influenced by politics and more by making reasoned decisions, all that's going to go away.
Yeah.
And I think, and I haven't heard him specifically mention this, of course, one of those would be things like the Federal Reserve Chair.
Yeah.
Trump they won't lower the interest rates or whatever, fire the Fed Reserve Chair and put in somebody else. And right now he has that protected independence because of that. I think the Supreme Court is going to undo that. I have that sense. It's not guaranteed, but I have a sense leaning that direction. And when that does that, it just begins to consolidate and concentrate more power and make everything much more political in the administration. So our work of protecting democracy and defending democracy is going to get messier. It's going to get uglier. I think eventually it will prevail. It's not going to happen in a couple years. It's not going to happen in 4 years. We're talking probably a generation of working to get this into a healthy place.
Yeah. And in the meantime, I think of my grandchildren and this is, you're right. I mean, we're not trying to say, don't worry about it. It's a concern. By the way, the checks and balances. I mean, again, at the heart of our democracy was checks and balances.
Right.
And that the founders who believe that individuals, human beings could not be trusted with too much power.
Exactly.
So the way to do this is to balance it out. And
right.
We're now in a situation where, we could give the president more authority. Of course, it's real interesting that if you're right and the Supreme Court goes that way, it'll be interesting to see what the Republicans think of the unitary executive if a Democrat gets elected.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
I guess they won't be too fond of that. By the way, I got to say one other thing about the Supreme Court, and that is, I have always been careful about trying to be critical of Supreme Court justices for 2 reasons. One is we're not constitutional scholars.
Right.
I like the Constitution. I've read it. Actually, I've got books on the Constitution. I've read on it.
Right.
Doesn't make me an expert, right? But
right.
I've read it because it interests me. But I've always been careful to avoid too much criticism because, let's be honest, most Americans believe a law is constitutional if they like it.
Right. Yeah.
Don't like it, it's unconstitutional. This
Right.
is the way it works. So I've been very careful to criticize either conservative or liberal justices.
Right.
But I got to tell you, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito,
Yeah.
I think the two of them have become horribly compromised.
Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah.
And they're there, but
Right.
um, and they're making decisions. But I really think they've been horribly compromised. And I was the one, and I actually thought Alito originally was a good choice, and I thought Clarence Thomas, I thought the Democrats probably piled on more than they should have.
Right.
That was just my opinion at the time, but I
Sure.
think they're both horribly compromised now. So,
Yeah. I
all right,
agree. So my basic point was is that the courts are not going to save us.
yeah,
Um, they may do some things. I could be totally surprised they come out with a 5-4 decision that protects some of this kind of stuff. That will be helpful.
yeah,
I don't think you can look to the courts to protect this. We don't know what the future if that gets undone, where we don't have that kind of check and balance. Somehow, some new check and balance has to emerge to develop. I have no idea what that looks like. That's above my pay grade
yeah. I don't
figure
either.
out how that
Yeah,
works. But
yeah, it's a really
so,
good.
so
But
anyway,
here's the good news. The good news
yeah,
is we've had over 2 centuries of this of democracy,
right,
and the American people are used to
yeah,
it. We don't want our voices to be muffled,
yes,
and so we will speak out.
right,
We do have a sense, I think most people, not all, on the extremes,
yeah,
have a sense of what's fair
right,
and have a sense of what is unfair.
right,
And I think that the good news and the silver lining of all of this is I expect that we're going to continue to see pushback in various ways. And by the way, we've got Democratic governors who are
yes,
not going to sit there lying. And my Republican governor, Mike DeWine, who has done some things. I mean, he was the one Republican that really handled COVID well. He did a good job.
right,
And I've, in general, agreed with a lot that he's done, although there's some things I want to quibble with.
right,
But he came out on the fourth anniversary or third anniversary of the attack on Ukraine with a proclamation
yeah,
on the support for the Ukrainian community and that this was an invasion.
right,
And so even some Republican governors, I think, are who have certain constituencies are
right,
going to find some of this to be too much. So I
yeah,
just think that little by little, with other things going on, I do think over time we will prevail. But in the meantime, it's going to be ugly. And again, the worst part of it all is a lot of people are going to get hurt, and there's no other way to say it.
right. And I would just add this one last piece. I know they're somewhat controversial, but Will Strauss and Neil Howe, their idea of generations and this idea that there are cycles in which history moves. Um, I find some credence in some of the things that they talk about, but there appears to be about every 80 years ago, every 80 years or so, uh, society kind of coalesces around a way to operate. And then over about an 80-year period, that sort of builds and then dissipates into kind of a chaos. And then it reemerges again out of a chaos into a new structure.
Yeah.
And the new structure never looks like the old structure did exactly. And so you have the Revolutionary War. Roughly 80 years after that, you have the Civil War. Roughly 80 years after that, you have the Great Depression, World War II. Well, guess where 80 years after that is?
Yeah.
And here we are. And so these are unusual times. And that's one of the things where he's talking in this video about there are 5 reasons Trump will fail. All of those are true, but I think this is an exceptional period that is beyond the things that normally have defined most cycles. This is different. And so I take what he says. I take some importance. I attribute some importance to it. I think he's got some stuff there, but these are exceptional times.
Yeah. Yeah, and sadly for those who are who have the misfortune of being born in those times, that
Yeah, right.
the sadness of it. If I can end with a quote from Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, when Frodo says, "I wish it hadn't happened in our time," and Gandalf says, "Neither do I, but we don't get to decide,
That's
choose
right.
times to live. What we'd have to do is decide what to do in
Right.
the time that we've been given. So the task here is what to do in the time we've been given." So,
Right.
uh, you know, uh, the other thing that's to this, we got to end because we're, but In the midst of this, what keeps me going, Michael, one of the things that keeps me going is the great stories of courage we're seeing.
Right.
People who refuse
Yeah.
in little ways, not necessarily
Right.
ways, big ways, but who in little ways uh,
Right.
are finding ways to resist this. And I get courage. I get courage
Right.
from the people who are speak the truth, even if your voice shakes.
Right.
It's okay. So I've been heartened by that. All right.
Give wit give
Go ahead.
witness where we are in the place that we are, and keep working to uncover the illegitimacy of so
Exactly
much
right.
that happened. Expose it wherever it is, in whatever way you can. Yeah.
And we will be covering this, Michael, as long we'll be doing our little part as long as the Trump cacistocracy exists.
That's right.
We'll be doing it.
Yeah.
So,
There you go.
well, friends, thanks for joining us. No, it was a little long, but we hope that you find it useful. I have the links in the description. Please remember that if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe. Um, that help gives us fame and fortune and accolades and contracts for toothpaste and things like that.
There you go. Right.
And if you're watching or if you're listening on podcast, go ahead and like us. That helps us too. So, friends, this is Faith Seeking Understanding. I'm Alan Bevere, and a reminder that the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand." So, friends, keep seeking.